The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, how pandemic profiteers are deepening America's wealth gap, plus the unauthorized history of the NRA. And Bill Press talks with David Corn, Washington bureau chief for Mother Jones. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Chuck Collins is a longtime advocate for greater economic equality in America. He says billionaires are only getting richer during the pandemic. And if we don't act now, inequality will only get worse. And we say hello to Chuck Collins, director of the Institute for Policy Studies program on inequality and the common good, where he recently co-authored a report titled Billionaire Bonanza 2020, Wealth Windfalls, Tumbling Taxes, and Pandemic Profiteers. He's also co-editor of inequality.org. Chuck Collins, welcome back to the program.
Hey, good to be with you, Jim.
Nice to be with you as well. Obviously, there has been a great deal of reporting about how many Americans are experiencing economic hardship during this pandemic. But you've been tracking a different story, which is how some people are actually getting richer. What kind of data are you looking at, and what does it say?
Well, I think the way I would describe it is we're living in the tale of two pandemics. We have been looking at what's happening to the bottom 60% of workers who have very little reserves and little financial cushion in their lives. But the other piece of the story is what's happening at the very, very top with the wealthiest people, say the top 1/10 of 1% on the billionaire class. And what's clear is we are not in the same boat. They are delinking from the rest of society, and their wealth is actually accelerating, while other people are in the, one paycheck away from destitution.
Mm-hmm. You describe in your report, we entered into this pandemic with a kind of quote unquote pre-existing condition of inequality. How wide is the gap, and how does it define how people experience this pandemic differently?
Well, I think the first thing is that, there's obviously the bottom third of wage earners are extremely vulnerable. I mean, I think what we're finding is there's a lot of vulnerability and very little protection because of an insufficient safety net, people not having access to health insurance, wages being low. So we went into the pandemic with a lot of people kind of living close to the edge already. And then we also went into the pandemic with this wealthiest 1% or the billionaire class that has kind of not only social distanced, but they've economically distanced. They've pulled away. They have multiple houses. They've left the hot spots. They have the ability to control a lot of resources and protect themselves. And so it really is, people are having wildly different experiences depending on their socioeconomic and racial background.
Yeah, I saw somebody who wrote something the other day. If this was the greatest economy of all time, why is it that people can't survive for more than 2 weeks without some form of assistance or whatever? And that's not just a few people. That's a lot of people. As bad as inequality was going into the pandemic, your work indicates it's likely to get even worse. In part, this is because for some, the pandemic is a business opportunity. You call them pandemic profiteers. Give us an idea of who we're talking about here.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the economy on autopilot will create greater inequalities as we go forward. But there's a segment of people whose wealth is surging at this point. And you probably remember back in February and March, there were a lot of stories about all these billionaires who've lost their money, and 40 billion dollars off the top 2 or 3 billionaires has vanished, and that really story has changed. And in our report, Billionaire Bonanza, we started to look at, starting on March 18th, what was happening at the very, very top. And between March 18th and April 30th, really over 6 weeks, 30 million people lost their job. But the billionaire class as a group, their wealth went up $406 billion. And then there were 8 billionaires who saw their wealth go up by multiples of billions of dollars. And we called them the pandemic profiteers because their wealth was coming from owning video conferencing platforms, being involved in pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturing. Obviously, the case of Jeff Bezos, where we're doing more online ordering and delivery of products. Those are where these huge fortunes were surging. And it made me wonder, like during times of war, when there's been war profiteering, we should be monitoring this much more closely.
As you make clear in your report, it's not just business opportunities that are feathering the billionaire nest, it's policy. What have you seen in the stimulus measures that have passed so far that could leave us with more inequality coming out of this pandemic than we had going in?
Yeah, it's a tremendous concern that, for instance, in the CARES Act that passed in March, the same legislation that is supposedly sending us stimulus checks, there was a provision that gave a $135 billion tax giveaway almost exclusively to millionaires. 43,000 business owners making more than $1 million a year will get an average tax break of $1.6 million a year. So that's an example of how we design these stimulus and recovery programs will tell us a lot about whether we grow together economically or whether we further pull apart. And at this point, it looks like we're just going to keep pulling apart if business as usual continues.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Chuck Collins, director of the Institute for Policy Studies program on inequality and the common good, also recently co-authored the report Billionaire Bonanza 2020, Wealth Windfalls, Tumbling Taxes, and Pandemic Profiteers. Chuck, billionaires are not completely immune from taking a hit during this pandemic, as you pointed out a moment ago, but they are in a better position to bounce back. Beyond the obvious, they're billionaires. What's their advantage?
Well, we actually, in our report, we looked back at 2008 because, during the Great Recession, billionaire wealth did go down $300 billion. U.S. billionaires lost that amount. It took almost 2.5 years to recover that amount. But they did bounce back faster than wages, home equity, the employment rate. And in fact, only 20% of the population, the U.S. population, has gotten back to where they were in 2007 in terms of savings and net worth, which tells us that 80% still had an economic hangover from the Great Recession coming into this pandemic. What the rich have going for them is that their wealth is diversified. They can move their money around. They can move it out of asset investments that are losing money, but they also have power. And that's the problem here. The billionaire class has the power to shape the rules, including how these stimulus bills are designed. And that's the ultimate source of their wealth and power.
Going right back to the policy question a few moments ago. I mean, they kind of own it in a way.
They kind of have the ability to rig the rules. So it's heads I win, tails you lose.
Yeah. There are examples during this pandemic of billionaires giving to charity. We should welcome that, though, right?
Yeah, I think, and in fact, Forbes magazine has this whole tracker where they kind of keep track of, this billionaire is lending his hotel for workers, and this billionaire is giving, 0.0001% of their wealth to help their fellow human. But you don't want to, I'm not criticizing those acts of generosity, and in fact, some of them have saved lives. What's interesting in this case is I think this moment has exposed a design flaw in how we do charity in this country. There's $1 trillion sitting in private foundations. There's $120 billion sitting in donor-advised funds. All of these are controlled by the wealthiest people in the society. They've already taken their tax breaks, and yet there's no mandate that they move those funds to meet these urgent needs. And one of our recommendations is that Congress institute an emergency charity stimulus, just requiring that these foundations double their mandated payout. They only have to pay out 5% a year. We're saying pay out 10% a year. These donor advised funds, which are like mini foundations, have no payout requirement. So, I gave $1 million to my donor advised fund, but there's no requirement that I move it at all. So that's a design flaw that we think Congress lawmakers can fix, and that would unleash $200 billion into the nonprofit charitable sector. Think of those food banks and other organizations that are really helping people right now, but are struggling themselves. That could make a difference.
The establishment of the Pandemic Profiteering Oversight Committee that you talk about, we're watching this president get rid of anybody who has anything to do with any sort of oversight. How would this work? I mean, how do you make this happen?
Well, it has to really be a congressional oversight committee. The executive branch, it's clear, is not going to watch the till. And actually, as part of the stimulus bill, Congress did create several oversight committees that are monitoring how it's being used, who's benefiting. I think we should look at what we did during World War II. When Harry Truman was in Congress, he ran the Truman Committee, which oversaw and pursued and subpoenaed war profiteers. We implemented excess profit taxes, so companies that were making huge windfalls when everyone else was making sacrifices paid higher taxes, and that went into investing in the things that helped everybody. So I think that's one of the things that we should be pressing for, especially with an executive branch that doesn't really seem to care about where the money's going.
The 10% millionaire income surtax, you make many more recommendations in your report. Where can our listeners find it to read for themselves and perhaps get involved and maybe, push their congressmen and senators to get this kind of thing into action?
Yeah, I would invite your listeners to visit our website, inequality.org, and you will find the Billionaire Bonanza report there. And you'll also find a whole portal for taking action. And we send out a weekly newsletter every Monday. It comes from me, and it has different action alerts, things that people can do along the lines of what we're talking about. So that's a place for people to learn more and take action.
And again, that's inequality.org if you want to get involved and just kind of do your part, because we're all in this together. It's not us against them or anything like that. This is everybody as one. Chuck Collins, director of the IPS program on inequality and the common good, and again, where he recently co-authored that report, Billionaire Bonanza 2020, Wealth Windfalls, Tumbling Taxes, and Pandemic Profiteers. Chuck, as always, thank you for your time with us today. Look forward to having you back again soon.
Thank you, Jen, for having me.
Absolutely. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure,
I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America. Whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, what the NRA doesn't want you to know about its past. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Our society has coined expressions like philanthropist to encourage and hail people's charitable spirit. Look on the flip side of that shiny coin of generosity, however, and you'll find that its base substance is societal selfishness. After all, the need for charity only exists because we're tolerating intentional injustices and widespread inequality created by power elites. A society as supremely wealthy as ours ought not be relegating needy families and essential components of the common good to the whims of a few rich philanthropists. Yes, corporate and individual donations can help at the margins, but they don't fix anything. Thus, food banks, health clinics, etc. must constantly scrounge for more charity, while big donors have their charitable spirit subsidized with tax breaks that siphon money from our public treasury. Especially offensive to me is the common grandiose assertion by fat cat donors that charity is their way of, quote, giving back to society. Hello? If they can give so much, it's probably because they've been taking too much. As business columnist Andrew Ross Sorkin points out, all too often, charitable gifts are used to make up for the failure of companies to pay people a living wage and treat their workers with dignity. It's not just the unemployed who rely on food banks, but janitors, nannies, Uber drivers, checkout clerks, and others who work full-time but are so poorly paid they can't make ends meet. That's not a sad charity case, but a matter of criminal exploitation by wealthy elites. And the charitable thing to do is to outlaw it and require a living wage for all. This is Jim Hightower saying, as Sorkin puts it, the aim should be to create a society where we don't need places like food banks. We should be trying to put the food banks out of business.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Journalist Frank Smyth has been writing about the NRA for over 20 years. He's brought that work together now in a new book that offers a definitive account of America's most powerful, secretive, and controversial nonprofit, and how far it has strayed from its origins. And we say hello to Frank Smyth, independent award-winning investigative journalist specializing in armed conflicts, organized crime, and human rights overseas, and on the gun movement and its influence at home. He is a former arms trafficking investigator for Human Rights Watch. His new book is titled The NRA, The Unauthorized History. Frank Smyth, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
My pleasure, Jim.
Great to have you with us. So the NRA that we know today is not the NRA we once knew. Take us back to an earlier version of the NRA, and how was it different than today?
Well, for instance, the NRA claims that that the NRA is the nation's oldest civil rights organization. This is completely incorrect. The NRA didn't start talking about gun rights until 50 years after it was established in 1871, and didn't embrace gun rights as its unyielding aim until 1977. So this whole focus on gun rights, which the NRA today claims goes back to its origins, is actually not true. That's only been in existence for the past 43 years when the NRA became radicalized in the 1970s. The NRA also, before that shift in 77, before what's called the Cincinnati Revolt, their own internal gun rights revolution, was also once as green as Sierra Club, defending polar bears, defending the Mexican jaguar, defending elephants, worrying about elephant terrain in Kenya, and embracing what they called then hunter conservation and wildlife conservation, even suggesting, Jim, the notion of taxing ammunition as a way of promoting wildlife conservation, something that would be an anathema to the present day NRA. But most importantly, the NRA from the 1930s through the 1960s supported gun control, including the nation's two strongest gun control laws. And this is something they don't want anybody to know about. But the irony of them burying their own history is they're also burying the great patriotic war records of a great many of their former leaders. Even though they were war heroes, they all supported gun control. So the NRA has tried very hard and successfully, unfortunately, to keep all of this in the dark.
You mentioned 1977 and Cincinnati. What were the forces and interests at play that made this such a pivotal moment?
Well, there was a Gun Control Act of 1968 was something that the NRA supported. And hardliners in the NRA became radicalized over that and plotted and then took over the organization 9 years later. The Gun Control Act of 68 was passed in the wake of the assassinations of JFK, Martin Luther King, and Bobby Kennedy. And it banned the interstate sale of mail-order guns like the rifle that was tied to the assassination of JFK. So it seemed like, and the NRA at the time said, we don't take an ostrich attitude towards firearms legislation. We know that modern society has challenges and complexities that require a reasoned approach. That's something that in 77 all went out the window. And since then, the NRA has rewritten its history to claim that they've always been supportive of gun rights, when in fact it was that 68 law that radicalized them, which led to the NRA that we know today.
So, the NRA has invested in this ideology of gun rights and tried rewriting different aspects of American history to support the ideology. What are the defining features of that ideology?
Well, the defining features are twofold. Number one, no gun owner should ever be penalized or even inconvenienced for the actions of other people who are handling guns. So the NRA's position is that gun rights cannot be violated because somebody takes an AR-15 and goes in and shoots up a school. That is not their fault. That is not their problem. And the second thing is that they maintain, and although they only say this in different ways in different places, right? Because they realize that they come out and say it too strongly, it could work against them with, let's say, soccer moms. But they have promoted the view and taken the view that the population requires weapons and unrestricted access to weapons so they can be ready, if necessary, to rise up and overthrow their own government to defend the Constitution as they perceive it. And this is an ideology that is unique to the United States among advanced nations, and that we now see in play in these armed protests. They're not just protesting the health measures on COVID-19. They're there intimidating presence with their loaded firearms as a means of saying, we are willing to defend our Second Amendment rights, which we think is what guarantees all the rest. And that's really the core of their ideology.
They want to be armed in case they need to go and overthrow the government that's going to come after them. And yet at all of these protests, they're all waving the American flag, sometimes the Confederate flag, screaming about, we're America, we're great, we leave our guns alone. There's a disconnect there.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. They want to be insurgents in waiting. And, I've embedded with guerrilla insurgents on several continents, so I know something about guerrilla warfare and what it takes. What they want is to be able to take their guns out when they want, brandish them in public in order to muscle their way through a political process, which is something that is really unique to advanced nations. It's something you might see in failed states, but it's not something you see in any other advanced nation in the world. And it's something that that has really come out of the NRA's ideology. Now, when LaPierre testified in Congress last in 2013 after the Sandy Hook massacre, Senator Durbin, Richard Durbin from Indiana, I believe, or Illinois, excuse me.
Illinois.
He asked LaPierre if he thought the Second Amendment was really about giving people arms to be able to fight the government. And LaPierre dodged the question because he didn't want to look controversial. And he said, well, that's what the founding fathers intended. And then he pivoted to talk about, but people need guns for things like hurricanes and natural disasters when the government is not there to protect them, right? Because he wanted to downplay that. But if you read their publications, if you read what LaPierre himself has written over a period of decades, they firmly believe that the Second Amendment gives them the access to not only access firearms, but have no registration of firearms, which is why you can't have what every other advanced nation has in the world, which is the licensing of firearms, the degree that they allow civilian use of firearms at all. Things like New Jersey, where I have purchased a registered Glock, right, requires 2 mental health checks, 2 criminal background checks, and getting a New Jersey firearms ID card, as well as having my firearm registered. No court has ever overturned that. They haven't challenged that. So that's permissible under the Second Amendment in New Jersey as well as Massachusetts. But according to the NRA, that's a violation. And what they want is for the entire nation to be able to buy weapons as long as you show ID. That's pretty much the only thing they want you to be able to do.
Did you have any problems going through all of that to register? Were there issues for you?
Well, you have to go to the local police station twice in New Jersey. First to apply in person for a New Jersey firearms ID card, and then go back and apply separately for the handgun permit, which allows you to buy 1 gun every 90 days. I think that's a good process because a lot of people who may be either criminally inclined or mentally unstable would be reluctant to go to a police station twice and be interviewed and have them run a check on them. Right? I had no problem with it. I had my own reason for wanting to purchase a Glock. This was back in 1993. And it's something of an inconvenience. It's certainly a lot of red tape. But as I write in the introduction to the book, for me, that seems a reasonable requirement, that I can still have this weapon, a tactical weapon, a so-called assault weapon, which is actually also what the gun industry called it as late as 2008, by the way. It's not a term made up by liberals. It's a term made up by the gun industry to promote their own sales. But I was able to get that weapon without any problems. But it did take a lot of red tape. But for me, that seems reasonable. For them, that's a terrible violation.
Well, and that's just it. The red tape. That was it. That was the only big issue that you had, was a little bit of red tape. Might have been a little bit of a pain for you, but other than that, you got what you wanted, and on you go.
Well, but if I had criminal charges against me, right, then it would have been a problem. But that's the idea. If you have a criminal record,
absolutely.
you have a record of committing crimes or a record of being accused of domestic violence, and there's a restraining order against you, you should not be able to keep your weapons, right? The NRA believes that's by and large, a violation of the Second Amendment, which is something that I think most people would disagree with.
Yeah, absolutely. We're speaking with Frank Smyth, independent award-winning investigative journalist, and talking about his new book titled The NRA, The Unauthorized History. Frank, as you well know, the NRA today is one of the most powerful political lobby groups in America. How do they use their power? Is it solely to preserve gun rights, or does it go beyond that?
Well, it's all about gun rights. That's their driving force. That's their driving principle. That's their ideology. And they've been true to that. And they've managed to expand gun rights over the past 25 years throughout the nation, right? 25 years ago, most states didn't allow for the open carry of firearms. Now most states do. That's directly as a result of the NRA's lobbying state by state, where they have a real machine. And the other thing that they have, Jim, is an army of grassroots supporters who vote on command, who vote on gun rights on this single issue in states and in national elections across the country. And that's the key to their power. There's no group on the left or among the Democrats that has that level of grassroots power, that kind of responsiveness like they do, which goes much bigger than their membership, which they claim of 5 million, which may or may not be true. But they have that power. But what they've done recently is they've taken this gun rights agenda and they've managed to embed it in the planks of the Republican Party only in the past 4 years. In the late 2000s and the early 2010s, the top speaker the NRA got to speak, to be the keynote at their national conventions or annual meetings was the erstwhile Fox News star Glenn Beck. Before and after, he was dismissed over his anti-Semitic ramblings on air. Now, the NRA annual meeting has become a forum for every major leader in the Republican Party, starting with President Trump every year, even starting before he was elected, also speaking Vice President Pence, also speaking Senator Ted Cruz, and a number of others. So what they've done is they've taken their gun rights agenda and they've managed to, which is based on an ideology and also based on a lot of myths that we can also talk about, and have interwoven it into the Republican Party and convinced tens of millions of voters in America that the only thing that's keeping them free is gun rights, and the gun rights in the hands of the people you see out there demonstrating against COVID-19. And that is something that is truly exceptional in the United States.
So now, being a part of the NRA is clearly about much more than owning a gun. It's an identity. And that firmly plants them in a particular location in the culture war with very little room for compromise. Does that continue to serve their purpose?
Well, it's so far served their ends, right? I think the gun rights issue is now as polarized as the abortion issue, that there is no middle ground. And that's part of what they've decided to do. Their entire strategy since 77 is to be unyielding, to quote the father of their revolt. Or absolutist, as was Wayne LaPierre, the new CEO, or the CEO of the past 29 years, not new, but the successor to Carter, has also claimed. So it's an identity which, at their annual meetings, there's invocations of God and often Jesus at every meeting, at almost every turn. They also honor servicemen and women. This is part of their ethos, right? And they also honor law enforcement. But yet, they don't want anyone to lift the lid on their past, because the exhumation could show there are a great many war heroes that the NRA has buried precisely because they supported gun control. One of them was a man named Milton Record, who fought in the supportive role in the Mexican expedition against Pancho Villa, who then was decorated in World War I, decorated in World War II, and he was the longest-running executive director of the National Rifle Association in its history, until 6 years ago when his tenure was surpassed by Wayne LaPierre, who's been in power for the past 29 years. This man is a great man, a great American, and somebody you would think the NRA would hold up as a legacy of their extraordinary history. But they do not. They keep him buried along with a number of others because he supported the gun control, the National Firearms Act of 1934 that outlawed machine guns or submachine guns during the Tommy gun days of Prohibition and right after Prohibition of Al Capone. And he said, this is what sane and reasonable law in an oral history that the NRA itself did in 1974, that after this, that 3 years later, after the Cincinnati Revolt, they've buried it and no one has ever seen it since. And I uncovered it in a university archive. So that's the way they've operated. They have a great legacy. They don't want anybody to know because it's all about gun rights, and they're willing to rewrite their own history and other parts of history to promote it, even though it's false.
I mean, it's fascinating and disturbing history. But as we all know, the point of history is to learn from the past, and especially mistakes and more positives that we can move forward with. But for those of us interested in American politics, what do we learn from the work that you've done here?
Well, what we've learned is that the NRA is not the organization that it purports to be. The NRA was promoted marksmanship and was founded in service to the government in 1871. It was founded by men who were Union Army veterans who had seen great carnage and wanted to improve the riflery skills of American soldiers as well as civilians so they would be prepared for future wars, which they would expect would come with Europe, which eventually did, though it took a while in World War I. The NRA supported the government, supported the military, and really was close in the beginning to National Guards, but supported shooting competitions as a way of improving rifle skills. That was their focus along with gun safety for more than 100 years. And then after World War II, they supported hunters as hunters infused their membership and had them grow eightfold. from after World War II to 1968. So this is an organization that was, and they don't want you to know, for instance, that the original NRA copied its range designs, its scoring system, its actual targets, which were giant iron slabs, and even its very namesake from the National Rifle Association of the United Kingdom, which was founded 12 years before. They don't want anybody to know that. There's also a National Rifle Association of India. They don't want anybody to know that. They've never been the same groups, as it was recently erroneously stated in a review about my book. They're not the same groups. The NRA copied the British one and then came out of it. The NRA doesn't want anybody to know this because the NRA wants you to think that the NRA has always been a gun rights organization. And nothing could be further from the truth. Gun rights didn't appear until 50 years after they were in existence. And they didn't mention the Second Amendment, for instance, until 1952. They don't want anybody to know that because that's their guiding principle. So it's the amount of myths that the NRA has told about itself that is dangerous, in addition, if we have time, to rewriting the history of each Reconstruction and the Holocaust.
It's just, I mean, it's amazing to me that the history of it, protection of animals, being for gun control, all of that lost. And at least in today's narrative coming from the NRA. Thank goodness you've written this book.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and I really enjoyed it. And I must say, I knew the history would be interesting. I had no idea how exquisite it would be.
Yeah,
incredible men who, two of them were Brooklynites, for instance. One of them, William Conan Church, was a founder of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He was something of a Renaissance man. He wrote a 500-page book, one of the first large pieces of scholarship about the role of Ulysses S. Grant in the Civil War and Reconstruction. He also was a railroad inspector for the Northern Pacific Railroad. He was a founder of the New York Zoological Society in Manhattan. The other co-founder was a man named George Wood Wingate, who was an extraordinary rifleman, a prolific writer who wrote detailed manuals about shooting, which were published by the other co-founder, who was also himself a co-founder of the New York City Public Schools Athletic League. And today in New York City, the top athlete for boys and girls in each sport still receives the Wingate Award. And Wingate was one of the first educators in the nation to promote sports for girls, introducing in New York City sports for girls in 1905, before I think most other cities around the nation. And that was really his doing. So these were extraordinary men who were also Union veterans who both served in the Civil War on the Union side. And as you see, those kind of men, military men who were great riflemen, who also were great patriots, is what defined the NRA for its first 100 years. Where now you see people like Wayne LaPierre himself, who was a civilian who never served, who got 2 deferments to avoid the draft in Vietnam. One a student deferment and one a medical deferment. And others, there are still military service people who are involved in the NRA, but their role is diminished. And that's why the modern NRA needs to promote and honor people who serve in recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in order to bolster their military ties, because they don't want anyone to realize how far they have strayed from their own military origins as an organization.
Wow. Pretty amazing. Frank Smyth, independent award-winning investigative journalist, the author of The NRA, The Unauthorized History. I highly recommend you go out and take a look at this book. Frank, we appreciate your time with us today and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you so much, Jim. My pleasure. Take care.
You're quite welcome, and you as well. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. From birtherism to Obamagate, Bill Press talks with David Korn, Washington bureau chief for Mother Jones, about Trump's phony narratives and the politics behind them.
Obamagate, he calls it. He said It's the biggest political crime and scandal in the history of the USA. And yesterday, the president tweeted out, the Obama administration is turning out to be one of the most corrupt and incompetent in U.S. history. David Corn, what the hell is he talking about?
Well, one guide that people use when trying to interpret what Trump is saying is to always basically say, well, he's really talking about himself, right? Because
Right.
When it comes to incompetence, we have not seen a greater act of incompetence in, I don't know, maybe in the history of the United States, certainly in the last 100 years, from a president than we've had with this response or lack thereof initially to the coronavirus pandemic. And when you talk about the greatest scandal ever, in the history of American politics, as he keeps saying about Obamagate, I would argue that the greatest scandal ever in the history of American politics ever, I mean, going back to to 1776, was that when Russia attacked the United States in 2016 with the intent of helping Donald Trump win the election, Donald Trump falsely denied this was happening and provided cover. He was in some ways in cahoots with Moscow. Whether there was collusion or not, his campaign met with a Russian emissary after being told this meeting was part of a Russian plot, a Kremlin plot, to help Trump get elected. And then when it became publicly known, or at least it was publicly suspected, that Russia was intervening in the election, Trump and his top campaign advisors kept saying, no, it's not Russia, it's not Russia. In essence, providing cover to Vladimir Putin by echoing Putin's own disinformation that they were not attacking, that Moscow was not attacking the election. So if you really want to look for the biggest scandal in American history, American political history, and the greatest act of incompetence, you have both with Donald Trump. And so what he's doing now is saying, no, it's not me, it's Obama. And when he talks about incompetence with Obama, I don't know what he is referring to. It's certainly not, has nothing to do with saving the auto industry or the economy overall after the Bush-Cheney, recession of 2008. It's certainly not what Osama bin Laden would say about Obama, that he was incompetent. So he doesn't give any real examples. It's certainly, getting, 17 million Americans on health care who didn't have it before, lowering taxes for the middle class. Now, I'm not saying Obama did everything right. There were other things he did that I would take issue with, policy-wise and action-wise. But, to say that he was incompetent it doesn't really, I don't know what the evidence is for that. And the scandal that Trump, is referring to with Obamagate seems, there's no evidence that, that Obama and Biden spied on him during the campaign and used the FBI to cook up a phony investigation, the Russian investigation, only to thwart, only to thwart Trump's from becoming president. Now, not only there's no evidence of this, it also doesn't make sense. Because if you look at what the FBI did during the 2016 campaign, it did nothing to leak information that it was investigating Russia and interactions between the Trump campaign and Russia. And of course, as we famously know, in the last week of the campaign, James Comey did revive the Hillary Clinton email controversy by notifying Republicans in Congress that there was more to look at, even though it turned out to be a big nothing burger. So, but with Trump, we start saying, but it doesn't make sense. It's not logical. There's no evidence, and that's never the point. It's never the point. He, is all about him just creating phony narratives that you and I end up discussing, or other people end up discussing, that can be red meat for his followers. What was the thing that put Trump on the path to the presidency? It was a conspiracy theory birtherism that had no factual basis to it, but it was dark and conspiratorial. Somehow Barack Obama when he was 0 years old, figured out how to phony up a birth certificate so that when he would run for president, 4-5 decades later, as a secret Muslim socialist who wants to destroy America, he'd be able to. So, you start with that as this sort of the original conspiratorial sin of the Trump presidency. And it is not surprising that now he's just totally making crap up. And he does it in a way that then reporters and others have to say, no, this is not the case, not the case. And so he gets what he wants after that, for his red meat base. He gets the media against him. See, the media is not on Obama's side because they say this didn't happen. So it's all about an echo in a garbage can, reinforcing the paranoid impulses of the right and his voting base. And it's all to what? Ultimately, distract from the fact that tragically we have lost 90,000 of our American neighbors, probably more. And certainly that number is going to top 100,000. And it goes back to what I started with, Trump's incompetence.
Doesn't it take it, though, to another level that we've never seen before for a sitting president to accuse the former president of crimes? I mean, not just I disagree with this policy. He didn't leave me with a plan to deal with a pandemic or whatever, right? But he's basically saying that the Senate should investigate and the Justice Department haul Joe Biden and Barack Obama in for criminal behavior.
Yeah, this whole notion of another level, Bill, I don't know. I think we ran out of levels a long time ago. I don't know where we get new levels anymore. Right. I don't know. Can we go to Lowe's or Home Depot and buy some levels? Because, I said that he started out with this crazy birtherism BS. And then what did he do throughout the campaign? Lock her up. He made, he said this was a criminal act. He said it was and it's always the biggest. Like, this is the biggest crime in the history of America. We've never seen such corruption. It's what he does. He is a bullshitter. It's about exaggeration. It's not, he cannot be shamed into abiding by facts or even abiding by reality. So when he comes out and says now that, instead of locking up Hillary, because remember, even like a year or two back, and not too long ago, he was still talking about prosecuting her and putting her in jail. And now he's he's talking about doing it to Obama and Obama's vice president, who seems likely to be his opponent in the fall, Joe Biden. What did he do with the president of Ukraine? Here are conspiracy theories that I want you to investigate, in order to get your $400 million in a meeting with me, in order to make Biden look bad. And he doesn't have to win. He doesn't have to win these debates. He doesn't have to prove Obama is the most corrupt president of all time. He doesn't have to get Obama in front of the Senate committee, which even Lindsey Graham, his lapdog, Trump's lapdog, says is a bad idea. He doesn't have to prove that Obama was born in Kenya. He doesn't have to prove the Biden Burisma thing. He just gets it into the damn bloodstream. And then people are talking about it. And, and this is a guy who thinks he can win the presidency. He won the presidency and thinks he can win it again by persuading no one, only by getting his base vote behind him. Every angry, older, white male in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan who likes to go ice fishing, nothing against ice fishing here, but he's going to find all those guys who are angry, whether it's, legitimate anger or sometimes it's, racial anger, let's be honest, and get them to vote for him. So he just needs to keep feeding the reddest of the red meat to these people, and he doesn't care that the New York Times says today Donald Trump accused Obama of Obamagate. which has no evidence, but nevertheless, it is yet another piece of ammunition in his campaign against Joe Biden. Whatever. If you talk about it in normal human terms, he wins. He wins. Even today, Bill Barr is out there saying, well, I don't think that we're going to end up with a criminal investigation of Obama and Biden in this Obamagate business. Well, just by having Bill Barr, this is how clever he is. He comes out and says, well, people can say, oh, he's throwing cold water on Obamagate. Well, actually, he's talking about it in a legitimate way. He's not saying there's this crazy, this bat crap crazy thing that the president's saying, and there's nothing to it. He comes out and very somberly says, well, I don't think at the end of the day we're going to have criminal, indictments of President Obama out of this. And it legitimizes the subject matter,
right,
even if you say it's not going to end up with Obama in jail.
And Bill Barr is also the one. I mean, isn't this? I guess my question is: isn't this all part of what Barr is doing, what Trump is doing, part of an effort to totally discredit the the Mueller investigation, and the whole Russian question?
Yes, that's Trump is crazed by the idea that his presidency was tainted by Russian intervention. Now, it happened to be Russian.
I want to interrupt just to say you and Michael Isikoff wrote a great book about this called Russian Roulette. It's still out there, still up on Amazon. Tells the whole story. So go ahead.
And thank you for mentioning it. What day is it? In about a month, we have a new expanded paperback edition of the book coming out. So
cool.
People should keep an eye out for that. But Trump is crazed by the fact, I'm not sure he knows it's a fact, that he got elected with Russian help. Now, I don't know whether he feels any guilt, because I don't think he's capable of feeling guilt, that he actually helped the Russians by denying it was happening and providing them cover. And this has tainted his presidency. And so he wants to do everything he can to remove that taint. How does he remove that taint? By discrediting the investigations. He kept claiming that the issue was collusion or no collusion. That really wasn't the case. The issue was whether he was helped by the Russians and whether, if he didn't collude in the actual attack, whether he enabled and empowered the Russians by basically taking their side and saying it wasn't happening during the campaign and dismissing this so that voters out there and the rest of us, didn't know what to think. So he helped them that way. He helped them try to get away with it. But he doesn't want any remains of this Trump-Russia investigation that, while it didn't come up with evidence of collusion, did show that the Russians attacked to help Trump, and did show in Robert Mueller's own report that Trump again and again falsely denied it was happening while seeking to exploit the attack. I mean, that's a really serious charge that has never gotten much attention because I think a lot of the media got lost going down the collusion rabbit hole. But he still wants to get rid of that. So he's been trying to, do two things. He's been trying to, create a complete false opposite bizarro, narrative that only plays on Fox, that the Trump-Russia investigation was illegitimate from the beginning, and it was done only as a way to thwart him. And then he wants to discredit what came next, what it evolved into, which was the Mueller investigation, which confirmed that Russia attacked and confirmed that they did so to help Trump, which is what the intelligence community had said before this, and also confirmed that Trump was a scoundrel while this was going on and played footsie with the Russians. So you're attacking the hoax investigation, as he calls it, saying that it was illegitimate at the start, and he has Bill Barr out there investigating the investigation, even though the IG, the Inspector General of the FBI, put out a very harsh report about certain aspects of the investigation, the FISA warrants in particular against a guy named Carter Page, still concluded that the investigation had not been politically motivated and had been started with legitimate concern about Russian intervention in the election and interactions between Trump and his circle and Russia while this was happening. And then with the Mueller investigation, well, what happened? It landed Roger Stone and Paul Manafort, in jail. Well, Stone's not in jail yet, but they convicted. It got Mike Flynn as well, pleaded guilty, and it just tarnished, 3 of his top aides and a bunch of other people too.
Michael Cohen,
which was part of Mueller, but also another outside investigation with the hush money to Stormy Daniels, bank fraud and everything else, ended up in jail. So Trump really wants to erase this. This is like Soviet revisionism. He wants to get some of these guys off the hook, not Michael Cohen, but he wants to get Michael Flynn, Roger Stone, and probably to some degree Paul Manafort off the hook in some way or the other. And Bill Barr is out there doing his bidding, having the Justice Department take positions that had never taken in the past. It seems to be that seem unfathomable to many veterans of the Justice Department and other legal experts. Yet Barr, when the Mueller report came out, creating a false context, claiming that it had exonerated Trump when that was not what the report said. So Barr is very actively out there trying to discredit the Mueller report, at the same time having U.S. attorneys investigate the origins of the FBI's Trump-Russia investigation. And what does this do? Ultimately, what the real terrible thing here is that the 2016 election was attacked by a foreign adversary and was attacked successfully in that the adversary got what it wanted at the end. It got disruption and it got Trump elected president. That's what the Kremlin wanted. And by focusing on the legitimacy of the FBI investigation, trying to undercut the convictions and prosecutions that came out of the Mueller investigation, Barr and his lackeys, they are removed. They distract attention from the original sin of the Trump presidency, the Russian attack and Trump's sort of informal or in collusion with it. And so we're not here. Here we are now, 2020. We've never really come to, I think, strong terms with what happened in 2016. Trump won't allow it. And we have Christopher Wray, Trump's appointed FBI director. We have John Ratcliffe last week, Trump's nominee to be director of national intelligence, both saying, as of now, this moment, as you and I breathe here today, Bill Press, the Russians are intervening again.
In 2020.
In 2020. Right. And so Trump, who can't acknowledge it happened in 2016, is not, hates to talk about it at all because that taints his election, his beautiful electoral victory. And so what action is he taking? When he talks to Putin, as he did a week and a half ago, is he telling him, stop this? Or is he coming out and saying, there's so much we can work on together? He's great. He knows this Trump, this Russia investigation, he knows it's a hoax too. That's what we were talking about. He is talking to the guy who attacked the United States and whose attack led to an FBI investigation and saying that we agree it's a hoax. I mean, sometimes I feel like I'm in a Hitchcock film. A lot of his films, somebody sees something and, no one else believes that the person has seen something and it's a murder or something terrible. Rear Window, The Man Who Knew Too Much. And I feel like, it's in plain sight that this has happened. And now Trump's in bed with a guy who attacked the United States. And he's saying, well, we both agree it's a hoax. I don't know why that doesn't stop every clock in town.
Bill Press talking with David Korn, Washington Bureau Chief for Mother Jones. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Chuck Collins, Frank Smyth, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.